Welcome to Norse Code, the number one podcast for your Minnesota Vikings. I'm your host, Dusty O'Connell. If you would like to become a contributor to Norse Code, there are two ways you can do it. You can throw a few bucks in the tip jar at paypal.me/NorseCode, or you can contribute via Patreon, become a recurring monthly contributor in any dollar amount you'd like to patreon.com/NorseCode. This week, we've got a crucial game for the 7-2 Minnesota Vikings, and joining me this week to break it down is, as usual, Minnesota Vikings blogger extraordinaire and generally useful human, Arif Hassan. How you doing, Arif?
I'm good. How are you?
I am well. I can report that the primary fermentation stage of my purple pale ale, or per pale ale, as a listener wrote in to suggest, is complete as far as I can tell. I'm going to give it one more day, make sure there's no more bubbles, and then we move on to priming sugar and secondary fermentation. So we are one step closer to beer.
That's awesome.
It is awesome. I'm excited. Joining us this week, returning guest. We last had him on before the Rams game in 2015, and we're grateful for his, I guess, triumphant return to Norse Code. We got Joe McAtee with us. How you doing, Joe?
I'm good. I want to be called generally useful, man.
Well, it took Arif years to earn that title, and I think he guards it somewhat jealously. So, I mean, I have no problem with it, but you'll have to take that up with him.
I don't want to dilute the importance of the title, but that's not to say no one can have it. I think you're certainly up there in the running. How about that?
I will tell you this. The one I've been rolling with most recently, my daughter started getting into the Harry Potter movies recently. I don't know if y'all have seen them, but there's one in which somebody comes through the hallway or whatever and says, "Get out of my way. I'm the head boy." And so for like the last 6 months, I've been telling people, "Oh, Joe McAtee. Yeah. What's your official title?" "I'm head boy." Head boy Joe McAtee.
Head boy Joe McAtee. I like the ring of that. Actually, I went to platform 9 3/4 in London when we were there for the Vikings Browns game, and I guess I wasn't really surprised by how commercial it was, but I was a little unprepared for how emotional I got when I was there.
That's heavy.
Yeah,
that is heavy.
So there you go. It's a real thing. It's like it's kind of like the Wailing Wall for nerds.
Except with slightly larger gift shop
for nerds.
No, it was a very multicultural experience. I heard probably 8 languages spoken by the literally 30 people standing in line to touch what was functionally half a shopping cart that was glued to a wall. So. So, pretty important football match coming up. The Rams are, with all the injuries to Seattle, are pretty much in the driver's seat for the NFC West. And the Vikings, with all the injuries to basically every team except for Detroit for now, are basically in the driver's seat for the NFC Central. But this could be a preview. I mean, assuming the Eagles fall apart, this could be a preview of the NFC Championship. And you guys are on a roll, Joe. What is the secret to your success? Is Jared Goff just that great? Or is Aaron Donald just rolling everyone that hard? What's the story there?
Well, I think the first part of the story is I don't think we're taking the existential threat of 2017 seriously enough. Culturally, politically, everybody is having trouble adjusting to these new normals. And the Rams aren't bad anymore, and I don't think enough people understand what the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse are actually supposed to look like. But I'm pretty damn sure that the Rams being mentioned as an NFC championship candidate is one of them. So I just want to point that out so that when we're all dead in a month, you can all say, hey, at least Joe warned us. The Rams were good, and he was the first one to recognize that was a sign of a metaphysical threat. That being said, part of the reason the Rams are better is the personnel additions that they've made. And part of it was addition by subtraction, right? A year ago, their top 2 wide receiver targets were Kenny Britt and Brian Quick. This year, it's Sammy Watkins and Robert Woods. A year ago, the starting left tackle was Greg Robinson. Now it's Andrew Whitworth. I don't think you can give enough credit to the front office for how they handled the personnel moves this offseason, if only because they could have coasted really, really easily on the coattails of assembling this coaching staff. It's, whether it's Sean McVay or Wade Phillips or all the way down the staff, the evidence throughout 9 games suggests that this is an incredibly competent staff. They're more than just the hashtags that we used to use to mock Dear Leader, our previous head coach, who we do not use. Yeah, like Harry Potter, we do not use his name anymore. He's just hashtag Dear Leader. They're actually identifying problems and then solving them week to week. And then obviously the last real big aspect of the performance turnaround is that the guys who were here are just playing better. Jared Goff, Todd Gurley, the right side of the offensive line. All of those guys were part of the NFL's worst offense a year ago, and they're all performing at a high level this year. So all of it's clicking together. I don't think you can point to one thing when you've got a turnaround as historic as this. It might be the first time in NFL history where we've had the lowest scoring offense in the NFL immediately turn into the highest scoring offense the next year. And I don't think you can point to one factor. I think it's all of it working together.
Well, sure. Let's talk a little bit about sort of the most interesting factor for any team. It's usually the quarterback. For this team in particular, I think it's the quarterback. I think once he figured out, which direction the sun rises in, he's really, I think, put it together. One of the things that I find kind of interesting is that there's a lot of indicators of play, statistically anyway, for Jared Goff, that indicate that he might be kind of volatile, which is not to say it's a bad thing, right? You've got a lot of good volatile quarterbacks, Brett Favre being maybe the best example, Cam Newton a pretty good contemporary one. But in this case, you take a look at his passing performances week by week, and you identify which teams have pretty good defenses, probably Seattle, probably Jacksonville to some extent, Arizona. And, in 2 of those games they came away with wins. But also it just seems like he wasn't passing as well in those games by, I think, a significant margin. It feels like he really dominates. And again, I'm just looking at statistically. The reason we have a guest is because you've seen the games. But it seems like he dominates really poor defenses more than most good quarterbacks, and then he underperforms against really good defenses more than most good quarterbacks. So does it feel like there's this sort of riding the crest of waves, as it were?
Kind of, and the dominance of those lesser teams really comes over the course of the game. It's not something where, whether it was Arizona, or you mentioned Arizona on the better side, take these last 2 games where the Rams didn't really come out firing on all cylinders in the passing attack. They've been more conservative in terms of how they approach these games offensively. But once you get into the second and third quarters, when the opposing offense is really, really struggling, and part of that is the play of guys like Tom Savage and a Giants offense without Odell Beckham Jr. and Brandon Marshall and other guys, when they start getting really desperate, that's what starts opening things up, because they're trying to get things done and the game starts coming to the Rams, and then our offense can take over. The 94-yard or 95-yard pass to Robert Wood last week was a pretty clear function of that. It wasn't there early on in the game, but the Texans needed to make something happen. They started pressing, and we caught them. I think the bigger thing is Jared Goff's only played 16 games in the NFL, and he's only played 9 now with Sean McVay. He's still got a ton of growth. He's only 23 years old. He's incredibly young. Right. So there's just a ton of development there. And as good as the last 2 performances have been, the games against you guys and Seattle and even New Orleans, who looks to have sign of the apocalypse, formidable defense. Those are going to be the performances where we learn a lot more about Jared Goff moving forward. And I will throw the disclaimer out there. You can have Sam Bradford. You can have Case Keenum. Keep your damn hands off our astronomically challenged young man. All right, Vikings fans?
Well, it is a Case Keenum Jared Goff revenge game. It's going to be exciting to see what the former Jeff Fisher proteges have to put on on for a show. Just both of them are just great thumbs in the eye to. Sorry, Dear Leader. No, I shouldn't have said his name.
To Dear Leader. Thank you. I did throw out on our podcast. My offer has now increased. I'm willing to pay $1,750 cash to sit next to Jeff Fisher and watch this game on a couch. So, we're considering upping that to $2,000 by tomorrow. So stay tuned. We'll see. I might be watching the game with old Dear Leader.
All right. Well, so you mentioned a little bit about how in the past couple of games the offense has been a little bit more conservative so they can open up a deep ball later. I'm taking a look at some of these statistics, and again, stats. But it really feels like the signature, the mark of the team, tends to be sort of more explosive. So, for example, it's Jared Goff is one of the leaders in a bunch of passing statistics, the NFL leader in yards per attempt right now, the NFL leader in adjusted net yards per attempt, 25th in accuracy rating per PFF, 24th in completion percentage, which, that is not an indicative stat in terms of quality, but it is a stylistic stat. It tells us that, if someone is doing well in a lot of these efficiency stats, but doing poorly in, say, completion rate, there's a lot of yards per completion, which, by the way, he's leading the NFL in as well, which you find kind of interesting. It also works under pressure, too. He's 5th in passer rating under pressure, 7th in passer rating when kept clean, but 26th in accuracy rate under pressure, 19th in accuracy rate when kept clean. So there seems to be some element of explosiveness to the way that they design their passing offense.
Especially once it gets clicking. And I think part of that is just who they have. You got Sammy Watkins and Robert Woods. You have to push the ball downfield. The other is the aggressiveness with which Sean McVay uses his tight ends. It's not a conventional kind of, inline and little curl route, the kind of we've been used to seeing a lot of times with the Rams prior to Jared Cook. He really likes to push his tight ends downfield. And so you've seen some huge gains with Gerald Everett. The other factor is that for whatever reason, and this was something I didn't really anticipate, but it's been there all year, is that Todd Gurley has become one of the better receiving running backs in the NFL. It happened again last week. I think it was a 34-yard result. Is that thing, and part of it is just the versatility of the offense. It's so hard for a defense to stay disciplined to cover 3 wide receivers, a tight end, and a running back, and still try to get pressure. And so you're finding these opportunities where Gurley just comes out uncovered once a game, maybe twice a game, and Goff's been good enough to get through his progressions and find him, and there's just a ton of space. And so I think those are the plays a lot of times that are adding to that yards after the catch to pump up those stats, more so than just, throwing bombs down the field all day. It's been this versatility that's opening up spaces in the defense. And to be honest, I don't expect a lot of that against you guys, but I think the bigger battle that might determine how much we can do downfield is going to come down to the battle between our offensive line and y'all's defensive line, and we saw this last week in the first half against the Texans, where Jadeveon Clowney was just wrecking shop. The Rams just didn't have an opportunity to put in a lot of that downfield work that they've been accustomed to that led to those stats. And if the Rams have that same kind of struggle against you guys next week, they may not even be able to work downfield with Sammy Watkins and Robert Woods in the first place.
Well, let's talk about that offensive line a little bit. I'll talk about the skill players in a second. There's some interesting stories there. But with the offensive line, you got Andrew Whitworth, left tackle, huge upgrade. Currently 6th in pass blocking efficiency per PFF. Yep. Probably even better overall as a tackle than some of the tackles above him in that statistical category. And then you've got John Sullivan, former Viking, 6th in pass blocking efficiency among centers. And he's doing just generally pretty well. But what I find kind of interesting is that the other offensive linemen aren't living up to sort of the standards being set by Whitworth and Sully. I've got Rob Havenstein at 43rd, Roger Saffold at 33rd, and I can't read my handwriting on this one, but he is evidently 44th.
Javon Brown.
Yeah, Javon Brown. Yeah,
Javon Brown.
So you've got a set of guards who, in terms of pressures allowed and stuff like that, aren't doing phenomenally. You've got a right tackle in terms of pressures allowed, aren't doing phenomenally, but in general, the Rams overall have been doing fine in terms of preventing pressure from getting to the quarterback. Jared Goff is in the top half of the league in terms of having the fewest amount of passing attempts under pressure. Do you think part of that has to do with pass protection from Todd Gurley, the tight ends? Do you think a lot of it has to do with play design? Or do you think that the sheer ability of Whitworth and Sullivan have a lot to do with overall reducing the amount of pressure on Goff?
Yeah, no doubt it's been Whitworth and Sullivan have been a big factor, and especially when you boomerang from last year where the Rams across the line were just absolutely putrid all year. It wasn't just that it hampered Jared Goff's development. It was that it cut out so much of the playbook. You just can't run an offense when you've got guys coming through the line. And when you turn your opposing defensive line into 4 Aaron Donalds, there's just no way to run an offense against that. So certainly having Whitworth and Sullivan has been a big help, and Sullivan's line calls supposedly have been phenomenal. His experience with McVay in Washington obviously has a big part to do with that. But I think the other part has been the system design. And Goff's talked about this, McVay's talked about it, and they mentioned it with the long touchdown to Robert Woods this last week, where on these designs, they know what they're going to do pre-snap. And it's all about what they're seeing pre-snap. And whatever it was they saw, they kind of alluded to it, but they wanted to maintain some operational security where they said what they saw from the Texans coming out of the huddle, they knew it was going to be a touchdown. And McVay was telling Goff, get to the line and run the play because the touchdown's there. And so it's these play designs where whatever Jared Goff is seeing pre-snap, he knows to just, whether it's a zone read and he's just throwing it to space, or whether it's a man read and he's just got to time it, it's making it much easier to avoid pressure because they're just not spending a lot of time back there waiting for stuff to happen. They know what's going to happen.
So one of the interesting aspects of play design for actually both the Vikings and the Rams is the heavy use of play action. The Vikings are second in play action percentage with Case Keenum. Jared Goff is third. First was Deshaun Watson. So effectively they're first and second. And a big part of that is the ability to sell play action from your quarterbacks. Case Keenum is evidently pretty phenomenal at it. I would imagine Jared Goff is pretty good too, but some of the reads that people make are off the offensive linemen. You've got a couple of experienced offensive linemen, Roger Saffold, John Sullivan, Andrew Whitworth, who should have a lot of experience being able to sell play action. Has the use of play action been particularly useful in terms of creating those explosive plays, do you think?
Absolutely. And I mean, the last Sunday was a perfect example. I think part of the credit too has to go to Todd Gurley. His viability as a runner last year just wasn't strong enough to sell on a play action. He wasn't as explosive of a runner. He wasn't anywhere nearly as patient. We've seen it. I think it was 2 weeks ago. It was either the Arizona game before the bye or 2 weeks ago against the Giants, where the first run of the game, and I mentioned it as soon as I saw it, it was the most patient run I've ever seen from him. He went to right behind Whitworth. There was no hole there, and he just kind of sat and waited. And it took about a full second and a half, but this huge gap opened up, and the first run of the game was a 15-yard gain. That was something he didn't do a year ago. And when you set that kind of a tone as a runner with the first run, I think that adds a level of viability to the play action as well. But certainly the offensive line play and Jared Goff individually have been a great part. I think part of it is having Todd Gurley and the threat that he provides this year has made the play action much more explosive than it has.
When I hear national people talking about the Rams, one of the phrases that keeps coming up is Todd Gurley in space. It's like one of the things you talked about, his ability to catch. He's third in the NFL in 15-plus yard runs. And despite the fact that I think the Rams are something like 15th or 14th in DVOA rushing or something like that, they've been able to crank out a ton of value out of Todd Gurley, both in the air and just finding ways to create space. Is that a result of sort of a refurbished offensive line? Is that a result of Sean McVay play design? Is it a result, like you said, of Todd Gurley maturing as a running back? What do you think is like sort of the primary motivating factor between cranking out sort of that value?
Yeah, I think the primary factor is the offensive line. It just wasn't there. And what was funny was you could kind of see it turn about week 6 last year, where Todd Gurley started giving up on the field on his offensive line. And he started, the kind of complaints that we hear all the time. Guys are dancing too much in the backfield. He's trying to make too many moves instead of just hitting a hole. And it was true, but it was because his on-field faith in his offensive line that had been there wasn't leading him to any on-field success. And because of that, he started questioning whether or not that was going to be the best way to approach these runs. And I think the play of this offensive line through the first month of the season, it took Todd a little bit to get going this year. But he absolutely has. And since week 3, it's the kind of thing that you kind of wish for a guy, especially a guy this young, this early into his career. It's only his third, season in the NFL. But because of his skill set, he's got that unique blend of a little bit of everything. He's got power, he's got speed, he's got agility. He likes to jump over guys. He's got that hurdling ability that finishes off. He loves to hurdle. But he can do it all, right? He's more athletic than Steven Jackson. He's stronger than Marshall Faulk. He's one of those guys that's an all-around running back. And you can't just use him in power situations, which was what they were reduced to last year. You got to figure out ways to get him the ball and get him an opportunity to make guys miss, and that's what he can do. And he's been doing it pretty damn well this year.
Let's talk about some of the other pass catchers then. So Robert Woods is number 1 in wide receiver rating. That's passer rating when throwing to wide receiver. 7th in yards per out run. A huge fan here, me, of Sammy Watkins. Hasn't been as productive in terms of fantasy points as I would have liked. And then, of course, there's also Cooper Kupp, who blew up sort of at the beginning of the year, has been kind of been a little bit quieter, especially as Robert Woods has emerged more and more. 22nd in yards per out run, so not bad for him either. What do you think about, Robert Woods kind of emerging in a big way? I remember liking him out of the draft and him kind of struggling in Buffalo. And what do you think about what seemed to be production-related struggles? Maybe he's doing well on the field, but certainly he's not putting up the statistics that people expected. What do you think about Sammy Watkins' play? And then what do you see as the future for Cooper Kupp?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think we talk about the Sammy Watkins-Robert Woods duo a lot at Turf Times, and there's this, what's the right word? I won't say it's one of those classic fan battles where you've got two camps that are just fundamentally disagreeing on what's going on. But a lot of people are in this camp where they're thinking they would suggest that Robert Woods is just the better wide receiver, and that one of the main angles that people have used to criticize Sammy Watkins is effort. There's been plays where he quite clearly is giving up on routes because he's just not the go-to read. And because we haven't seen that from Robert Woods, I think that's always going to draw ire from fans when they see you doing that on the field. And so a lot of people have pushed into this camp where, because of the numbers and because of just his highlight plays like what we got this weekend with 2 touchdowns in that third quarter, he's drawing a lot of focus from Rams fans as being the more successful wide receiver. My view is a little bit more contextual. And the touchdown, even though it's a 95-yard touchdown to Robert Woods, what's really interesting to me is Sammy Watkins on that play, because Sammy Watkins draws 2 defenders. And Sammy Watkins is the top of the wide receiver depth chart wide receiver who's drawing the opposition's best cornerback most of the time. When we signed Robert Woods, a lot of people were concerned that Robert Woods wasn't going to be capable of going against top cornerbacks in the league. And that was a view that I shared. But when we traded for Sammy Watkins, what not enough people were talking about was Robert Woods never had to do that, right? You push him down the depth chart, and Sammy Watkins is taking that off of his back. He's taking primary cornerback coverage off of Cooper Kupp's back, who can now work in the slot and be that 3rd down and 3 guy. So as much as Sammy Watkins' value might seem cut into by the lack of production, I think what he's doing is offering something on the field that defenses has to adjust to that maybe isn't getting picked up by traditional statistics. And I think that may be more valuable ultimately than what he might do with the ball, because it opens so many things up. And that's the real thing about the Rams passing attack, is its versatility. Whether it's Sammy Watkins, Robert Woods, Cooper Kupp, whether it's the tight ends, whether it's Todd Gurley, there is no go-to. We don't have an Adam Thielen that's soaking up tons and tons and tons of targets. And that's Sean McVay's system. And I think to a degree that can frustrate Sammy. He tweeted out some very, what's the right word, frustrated thoughts when we lost to the Seahawks. And as a top wide receiver, you can empathize with that, right? He wants to be, the classic Keyshawn mentality, throw me the damn ball. He wants the ball. He wants to be that guy. But this offense doesn't really call for that in terms of production and targets. What it calls for is for defenses to respect that. And the Rams have done a good enough job to use Sammy Watkins sporadically to make sure defenses keep honest with him, but they don't use that to keep going to Sammy. They use it by going to somebody else, and it's worked. And so it's one of those things where, he may be frustrated by being the guy that has to soak up that attention from defenses, but it might be the most important part of the passing attack that's made it as viable as it has to this point.
All right, well, so that brings up an interesting question. So, the Vikings have Xavier Rhodes, who, in my view, is certainly a top 10 corner, battling for top 5. I don't think he's quite at a top 5 level yet, but I gave him a Pro Bowl vote anyway. And then they've also got Trey Waynes, who's performed pretty well over the past 3 weeks, but has been sort of up and down. Those are their 2 corners. Do you see Xavier Rhodes shadowing Sammy Watkins then?
I would think so. And I to be honest, I think the Rams are going to force it. Only because it takes so much off the field for Jared Goff to just focus on the right side of the field and not have to worry about it. And it's so much easier when you know that your blind side's covered as a right-handed quarterback, and especially with those rollouts, the Rams do a lot of design rollouts to the right, where you can work that way and have everything push into that side, as long as Sammy can draw Xavier Rhodes and keep him on his side of the field. What'll be interesting to see is if you guys try to flip it, how the Rams respond. We haven't seen that a ton, but I certainly think that could happen because to this point, since nobody's done it, it's been really easy for Sean McVay's system to work over time because it's just so versatile and it doesn't demand a lot of those one-on-one coverages. So I think it may be interesting to see if you guys try to do that, how they respond, because certainly the talent's there in Xavier Rhodes and a cornerback that we probably haven't seen since Patrick Peterson back before the bye.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the tight ends. Gerald Everett, I'm a huge fan of, leads the league in deep catch rate, and I believe he's number one in deep passer rating or something along those lines. Certainly, he's been a deep threat. I think on 16 deep targets. Then you've also got Tyler Higbee, who I've got thoughts on, but that are not necessarily football related. He's 10th in yards per route run among tight ends. Everett is, if he had enough routes to qualify, is 7th. So that's a pair of tight ends who are pretty good in terms of their efficiency when they get on the field. They'll be up against, potentially Harrison Smith in man coverage, Andrew Sendejo a little bit more often. And then, of course, you've got Anthony Barr and Eric Kendrick splitting up who's going to cover the tight end, who's going to cover the running back. In terms of, they're both very young tight ends. In terms of that matchup against a fairly experienced safety group, a somewhat experienced linebacker group, what do you think about their chances of creating that space on their own, independent of, say, the kind of leverage that, Sammy Watkins or Todd Gurley can provide?
Yeah, the thing that makes it real interesting is that I'm high on both of them, too. They're just so young and inexperienced, right? Compared to, when you got Harrison Smith on the other side, obviously, that's a resume that neither Gerald Everett or Tyler Higbee can compete with. But Gerald Everett's incredibly athletic. His moves after the catch for a guy his size are just ridiculous. That's why he's a second-round pick out of South Alabama, is that he moves better than his size. Tyler Higbee, incredibly competent, traditional style inline tight end that didn't get used a lot in the passing game last year and has gotten some opportunities and really flourished with it this year. It's just one of those things where you want to see more, but because the Rams have so many opportunities with Sammy Watkins, Robert Woods, Cooper Kupp, Todd Gurley, as much as Sean McVay's system leaned on tight ends in Washington, the Rams just haven't had to really do that with much consistency. I'd love to see more of them, but it's one of those things where when you're getting what you're getting out of the other guys, it doesn't seem like that's really a requirement. And so they haven't maybe gotten the quantity of looks that I might have liked, but the quality's certainly been there. And when you look at Everett's work, it's been very sporadic, but when he connects, it's just tearing up chunks of field, and it's hard to get away from that.
Yeah, so one of the consistent themes I'm drawing upon is sort of the diversity of available targets, to all of the talent to make
it really is
use of those targets. Yeah. That's obviously very frustrating for defenses because it's very difficult to field a roster of 11 really good dudes. It's much easier to field a roster of 3 superstars and 3 whatevers, right? The Vikings are pretty close to, I'm not saying they have no weaknesses, especially because I'm a little bit suspicious of, Wayne's improvement. We'll see. But the Vikings are pretty close to having very few weaknesses. Their slot cornerback position has been upgraded dramatically, whether or not it's Terrence Newman or Mackenzie Alexander, since the first couple of weeks. And that's something I feel a little bit more faith in. Anthony Barr has improved substantially in coverage. Eric Kendricks is pretty good in coverage, despite his struggles this year against the run. You've got Harrison Smith, obviously. Andrew Sendejo is playing the best, play of his life, which you say every year, but he has continuously improved. It feels like the Vikings have very few weaknesses, and it feels like that's a different kind of defense than a lot of very good defenses that nevertheless would struggle in a matchup environment where the offense can choose where they go. How do you think the Rams will respond?
Well, it's like you said, it's just about the versatility, and we've seen it every single week, regardless of the strength of the competition. There's only one team where the Rams have really struggled on offense. That was Jacksonville. They got a phenomenal defense, and they did a great job shutting down the outside, which forced the Rams to go at the middle, and they struggled with it. Fortunately for us, we had 2 special teams touchdowns. That was the reason we won that game. It wasn't because the offense did a great job. We really only scored 13 points on offense. But what made it successful when it wasn't the talent of any one individual. It was that they were trying different things with different people. And when Jacksonville shut down the outside, they were trying to go to Cooper Kupp and the tight ends over the middle. So it may be one of these games where you get 3 different battles where, and I wouldn't be surprised if this is the case at all. The Rams come out and try to do their scripted offense early on. And if you guys shut it down, then it's okay. What is the response going to be? And Matt LaFleur obviously is a bit of a different offensive coordinator in that his head coach takes a ton of stuff off of his plate, where Sean McVay's calling plays. Sean McVay's pulling in these wrinkles, and really it's up to Matt LaFleur to almost scout the defense on the fly to try to feed him ideas for adjustments. And so I think we're going to see some of that in the second quarter before we get to halftime, and then that obviously final drive of adjustments into the second half. I wouldn't be surprised if this is one of those tales of 3 games of we try something, you guys stop it. What's the first adjustment, and then what's the next adjustment after that? That's kind of going to be what I anticipate in terms of who's going to be successful. I really don't know, man, because these are, in terms of our offense and your defense, they're both top units, and this is the kind of thing that playoff football, and obviously from where we sit, we both look like competent playoff caliber teams. That's the kind of battle that really only gets decided on the field.
One more question before we flip sides. Which matchup scares you the most? Is it, Daniil Hunter against Havenstein? Is it, Xavier Rhodes, Harrison Smith against, just the offense in general? Which player from the Vikings, scares you the most? I know Anthony Barr, as an athletic linebacker, has a little bit in common with Alec Ogletree, but from sort of a different angle. Which player do you feel dread watching from the Vikings defense?
Yeah, it's probably Everson Griffin. I mean, it really depends. Here's a question for you. How much do you guys blitz?
A fair amount. Certainly not as much as the Cardinals have over the past couple of years. They show blitz a lot. Very often they'll send 4. Sometimes the 4th person is a safety or a linebacker with a defensive lineman in coverage. So if you want to call that a blitz, you can. But, a fair amount, probably more than the NFL average.
Actually, it's not.
So that
this year, the Vikings have the lowest blitz rate since Zimmer arrived in 2014, per a story in the show notes, 23%, which ranks 22nd in the league.
And I'm a little bit suspicious of what they call a blitz, just because if you send 4, it's not a blitz, but sometimes it depends on which 4 you're sending. Well, I'll take a look at that.
Yeah, that'll be interesting, because I think that's one of the things that the Rams really struggled with last week, was how to deal with some additional guys. And so the assignments that they had were getting tripped up, and that let Clowney come in a couple times where the tight end was blocking Clowney. And then Cooper Kupp, a wide receiver, got thrown at him, which is not the matchup I don't think anybody designs, your slot receiver blocking Jadeveon Clowney. But it's one of those things where, because this is a relatively new offensive line, left tackle and center in their first year, right guard and right tackle only in their third year, that don't have a ton of combined experience together. And I think last week was one of those games where that showed at times to deal with the blitz. So whoever you guys throw in the blitz, that might be, even though it's 22nd in the league, I wouldn't be surprised if this is a week where you guys dial it up a little bit more, only because that seems to be the most susceptible component of the offense.
Yeah, fair enough. All right, let's talk about this other side of the ball. So the Rams have been known for some time for having this monstrous defensive line. And I feel like that focus has narrowed down essentially to talking about Aaron Donald. Michael Brockers is pretty good at stopping the run, but Aaron Donald is perhaps the best player in the NFL, period. No position, tags necessary. At the same time, it feels like, Robert Quinn, who had, one amazing season, at least one other good season, has kind of dropped off. What are your feelings on this defensive line overall?
Yeah, Brockers is actually one of the more underrated players, I think, in the league. He's done a great job at filling space, and especially next to Donald, you're always going to be overshadowed. It's kind of that Neymar, Messi component over in Barcelona, right? Where no matter how good you are, you're never going to live up to the guy with the headlines. And that's Aaron Donald. He's just that good. He's, over the course of 60 minutes, he's not consistently blockable. You can't. He does too much in terms of, his power, and he's got moves, but it's just his quickness. You're not supposed to see guys that size that quick. And so what happens is, before offensive linemen are really in their set, half the time he's already either underneath them or getting around them, because he's just so damn quick. And it's really unstoppable, given how many snaps an offense has to take over the course of a game. In terms of Robert Quinn, he's definitely fallen off, and it's worrisome, because back in 2014, he was really the strength of the team. As Aaron Donald, as a rookie, wasn't the commodity that he is now, having gotten so many headlines over the years. It was really Robert Quinn as the guy that most people were worried about dealing with in terms of a pass rush, and for good reason. But over the last 2 seasons, he's missed half of each with various injuries, hip and back. And it's one of those situations where Rams fans are starting to worry if those are the kind of injuries that maybe have have taken a toll on what he does in those really small technical ways that aren't necessarily perceivable for fans, because he's just not getting home and he's not getting the kind of pressure that he used to. And even last week, he was out, missed that game, and he wasn't really missed overall by the defense. We still got a comparable amount of pressure on the quarterback, even in his absence. And so I think it's one of those things where when you see that, and given his contract, Robert Quinn's one of those guys that it starts to feel like Rams fans are pretty comfortable moving on from, unless he does something different over these final 7 games. Because what's interesting is you look at their contracts, and Robert Quinn's getting an insane amount of money because he re-upped his contract after 3 years back a couple of years ago. Aaron Donald's getting paid less than $2 million. And I know it wasn't a huge story, but he was a holdout in the preseason, even missed the first game of the regular season because he came back so close to week 1. Aaron Donald's getting paid so far less than market value. It almost feels like we're stealing a bit from him because he just continues to his level of play is just absolutely absurd.
So for some context, PFF has a statistic that they call pass rusher productivity. Michael Brocker's 37th, not bad actually for a nose tackle. Robert Quinn 46th, Connor Barwin 57th. Aaron Donald, among defensive tackles and interior defenders, isn't just number one. Everyone expects him to be number one. He's number one by a healthy margin. So his pass rusher productivity of, I think, 16.1 is better than most defensive ends in the NFL currently, and is better again by a third than number 2, who is Geno Atkins at 12.1. So just an incredibly dominant defensive tackle, especially in terms of rushing the passer. Now, in terms of stopping the run, that seems to be more Michael Brocker's job. He's 4th in run stop rate. Donald still well above average at 28th, but that seems to be sort of something that the linebackers do. People like Mark Barron, Alec Ogletree. Mark Barron has a great run stop rate among linebackers, but I have a question too about sort of just edge protection. You've got one linebacker who's got pretty good, at least statistics. I don't know again about what that looks like on the field, but pretty good statistics in terms of his ability to get to the ball in the running game. But you've got one defensive tackle who's dominant at stopping the run in Michael Brockers, and then you've got a couple of defensive ends that are not that great at it. Alec Ogletree is all right, pretty decent play in terms of run stopping from the safeties. Unless I'm wrong, go ahead and correct me. But it just feels like this is a little bit above average in terms of run defense as a running defense. What are your takes on their ability to stop the run? And if you've got a runner who can run on the inside, like Latavius Murray, and a runner who runs on the outside, like Jerick McKinnon, who would you emphasize?
Yeah, it's been susceptible at times. They give first handoff of the game, Leonard Fournette, 75-yard touchdown. They've given some big games up to opposing running backs. So more so than the passing game, that's been the real deficiency. The good thing is they've cleaned it up the last couple of weeks. The one thing I worry about is just tackling, especially from Alec Ogletree. He's a converted outside linebacker, so he's not a traditional, run-stopping inside linebacker. He's great on the blitz, and he's incredibly athletic. He moves really well, but he's not a great tackler. He doesn't have a lot of power. He's a bit undersized, and so that's really where things have fallen apart for the Rams' run defense sometimes. So if you're asking me inside-outside, I'm going to the inside guy almost every day. As long as you can get around Brockers. He's a space eater, and Donald's so quick that he can get in the backfield and maybe force you to move. But the good thing is that the Rams are a very physical team on the outside. All the cornerbacks are, for their position, very good in run defense. So it's one of those things where I feel much more comfortable, penetrating from the outside on run defense than I do from the inside, because that's where they've been most susceptible over the course of the season, and I wouldn't be surprised at all if you guys find some success there.
Mark Barron's an interesting story, former safety. How just generally do you feel about his transition to linebacker?
It's been good. I mean, it's been better than I was worried about when he was coming over from Tampa, only because how susceptible he was. And, when we talked to Bucs fans about the move, they were like, yeah, he just can't be relied upon in that aspect of the game. And that just hasn't been the case with the Rams. He's one of those guys where, guys just need a change of scenery sometimes to be able to flourish. And he's been one of those guys where it didn't click with Tampa, but it certainly has, as early on as his first season with us. So I really don't have a lot of complaints about him. The good thing is his biggest deficiency is in pass coverage, but the Rams have such a good secondary that he hasn't necessarily needed to be relied upon that heavily, and he's done a pretty good job.
Yeah, no, I find that kind of interesting. That's sort of what these numbers I'm looking at tell me. The same thing is kind of true of another guy that people were thinking about as a safety, Telvin Smith in Jacksonville. Both of them are much better run defenders than they are in coverage. Is there do you think that's just like a weird quirk? Do you think there's a reason for it? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
The main thing I might guess with Barron is just athleticism. He's just not as athletic as Alec Ogletree. He's not as quick. Doesn't get off blocks quite as well in terms of just quickness. So that might be one thing where he struggles with dealing with guys that, especially being a linebacker in the middle, you're dealing with some slot guys and guys coming across the middle with a lot more athleticism than, say, your consistent outside wide receivers, guys like Mike Evans or even guys like Sammy Watkins. So that might be the one thing, but I'm not really sure. I'd have to go back and look. The good thing is he hasn't been isolated that much because they've got so much help coming down from the safeties. There was a play this last weekend. LaMarcus Joyner actually got hurt on it, where I forget who it was for Houston, got behind Barron, but as soon as he touched the ball, LaMarcus Joyner came and separated him, and it was a clean hit. It was incredibly physical. The guy it was Will Fuller. And Will Fuller had to leave the game because he got injured on it. And it's one of those things where when you have that safety protection, you don't necessarily worry about Mark Barron's liability in coverage because that you got safeties back there who are doing what they're supposed to do. And so it's one of those things where, Mark Barron's not a perfect linebacker, but he doesn't really have to be because the Rams have so much competency on the roster on that side of the ball.
Well, tell me a little bit about that safety group because it's a little bit different than what it looked like at the beginning of the year, right? Like, is John Johnson supposed to be playing right now?
Yeah. Well, he was drafted to, but it took him a while. I don't know whether it was just he didn't start the season. It was Maurice Alexander. I expected John Johnson to be the starter week 1. And so whether it was something in terms of playbook and system where he wasn't picking it up or coming from Boston College where maybe he didn't have the talent around him to get him used to playing at the speed that you need to support cornerbacks and linebackers, I don't know. There was nothing really made public about why he wasn't starting. But when he took over a couple weeks ago, it was clear that there wasn't a drop-off. He's been fine. LaMarcus Joyner's been above average. He's a great player, has been his whole career. They moved him back to safety this year out of the slot, which I think he's enjoyed because he does like to play more physical than most corners. The good thing is we found a competent slot corner in Nickel Roby-Coleman from this fire sale that we had from the Bills. Yet another guy that we brought over who's been absolutely fine. And so it's one of those things where if the worst you can do is a rookie in John Johnson, he did have one play where he took a bad angle earlier in the game. And one of the touchdowns, he was just confused about alignment. So it's a rookie mistake, but it's one of those things that you're going to get ironed out when you got Wade Phillips as a defensive coordinator, making a mistake in a game that you win 33-7 is the right time to make it. And so, maybe that's indicative of what was going on as to why he didn't start at the beginning of the season. But overall, he's doing a fine job.
Sure. Well, let's talk a little bit about the strengths and weaknesses of LaMarcus Joyner and John Johnson. Just in general, where do you feel they have really struggled as safeties?
That's tough because I don't. There's not a lot to point to, right? I mean, you're talking about a shutout, 33-7. Perfect in the second half against the Cowboys. Phenomenal against Jacksonville, albeit with Blake Bortles. But let's not trash Blake Bortles on this fine podcast. It's just one of those things where there's not a lot to point to where they've struggled as a secondary. And when you've got Trumaine Johnson, and I know Kayvon Webster was a third cornerback in Denver, but he's got that experience with Wade Phillips, and they're clicking every single week. The only real thing you can point to as a struggle for the secondary was the Cowboys game, the first half. But a lot of that was Dak Prescott just making plays. There was one play where Aaron Donald had him for a sack, and he did one of these. Well, when I talked to the Cowboys after the game, it was one of these weird plays that you make with not like your bodybuilder mirror muscles. You make it with your football muscles, like your hips and your butt. It was one of these things where he got out of the sack, and it was like, come on, man. Quarterbacks don't do that. That's not a thing a quarterback does, but that's what Dak Prescott does. And when you make those kind of plays, and now all of a sudden, you got tons of room to run into and guys are suddenly open because cornerbacks can't hold, coverage for 5 seconds. That was really what was breaking down in the first half of that game. They completely cleaned it up from the second half. And since then, there's not a lot of point to in terms of the safety or cornerback play with any real deficiency.
I find it kind of interesting. So the Rams are number 1 in defensive DVOA overall, number 2 in pass defense DVOA. You take a look at...
And that's the thing. They're number 1 in DVOA. I mean, that's crazy.
Yeah, that's wild, isn't it? But yeah, and it's kind of interesting. It's like number 2 and number 15 passing and running for both the offense and the defense. But yeah, I take a look at these cornerbacks. Nickel Roby-Coleman, 17th in yards allowed per snap in coverage. Kayvon Webster, 24th. Tremaine Johnson, 75th. But it's one of the top 2 passing defenses in the NFL. Why would, I mean, it could just be like a weird part about recording statistics. It could be Johnson's giving up a bunch of really short passes that are meaningless. But why? What do you think it kind of explains that?
I don't know. I'd have to go back and look. It might come from the early part of the season where they were dealing with some better attacks like Washington and Dallas. Because again, the last couple of weeks, there just hasn't been a threat. And whether it was Larry Fitzgerald, I mean, granted, we haven't really faced any wide receivers recently. But it's one of those things where when you're number 1 in DVOA, it's hard to find flaws. And, the last 3 performances is really, somebody posted a tweet in terms of the points they've given up in the second half over the season. There's only one game where they've given up double digits in the second half. It's just been such a clean defense from front to back. The really only flaw has been the inside run game. But yeah, in terms of what explains that stat from True, I'm not really sure. And what's interesting is he's the highest paid cornerback back in the league. Second year in a row where we franchise tagged him. He's playing for a contract yet again. And I don't think you'll find many Rams fans that have any complaints as the guy that's covering the best wide receiver week to week. As big of a challenge, as daunting of a challenge that is, he's stepped up yet again, man.
Yeah, well, let's talk a little bit about the matchup. But before we do that, Case Keenum, what are your thoughts?
Isn't it fun? Isn't it fun to see these quarterbacks, Jared Goff and Case Keenum in 2017 flourishing? I wonder what the common thread might be. I wonder. No, Case was always a talented guy, man, and always willing to take those hits, to stay in the pocket and take those kind of late throws that you have to a lot of times to be successful. You felt bad for him with the situation that he was in and how he kind of came to the Rams. Because what was funny was he was on the Rams a couple years ago, but came in late in the process, 2014. And because of that, never really got a shot. And so when he came over in 2015, it was one of those things where, okay, they're just bringing him in because he's got some familiarity from the preseason the year before. By the time that the Rams had moved on from Nick Foles, they had to go to Case Keenum. He goes 3-1 over the final stretch of the season, and everybody's excited for the Case Keenum show. And then you draft Jared Goff number 1 overall, and it's like, okay, well, we got to make Jared Goff the starter week 1. Oh, we don't? Okay, yeah, for sure. Let's do this Case Keenum thing a little bit longer. It's one of those things where he's not a bad QB, and I think you guys are finding that out. He's not. There's a lot of reasons why you wouldn't draft him in the first round. There's some obvious physical flaws, but in terms of somebody who can manage a system and make some pretty impressive throws, he's always had that on tape.
Case Keenum or Teddy Bridgewater? It's a Vikings podcast. We gotta ask.
Oh man. I know it's so hard though, right? And I think part of it, if this was week 1, if this was the preseason, the answer is Teddy Bridgewater, right? The problem is you guys are having to figure this out on the fly, coming off the performance that Case Keenum just had. I guess it depends really on if Teddy Bridgewater is really, really ready. Like, where is he at in terms of practice and game speed, given how much he's missed? Like, how close is he to looking like Teddy Bridgewater before he went down? If he looks like that guy, I could understand going to him. Like, if Zimmer really feels like he's back, not just 100% physically, but 100% in terms of game speed and mentality and all those kind of things that you need a preseason for and a training camp for, that he just isn't going to get. If he looks the part, then I could see it happening. But it's one of those things where, from afar, there's no way for me to know that. And if that's off, you got to keep rolling with Keenum, right? I mean, it's clicking as well as it needs to for you guys to get where you need to go. But yeah, I mean, come week 1 next year, I'd go with Teddy Bridgewater. But on the fly, that's a really, really, really hard decision to make.
Well, so one of the arguments that people are making is, and of the many arguments I've made, I don't think I've actually made this one, is that Case Keenum is not a, quote, Super Bowl winning quarterback. You're not going to win a Super Bowl with Case Keenum. But Teddy Bridgewater might be. But he's probably going to be rusty for a couple of games. So in order for you to find that out, you might have to sacrifice offensive performance for the first couple of games, have him ready for the playoffs, be at game speed come playoff time. Is that Is that a risk that you would be willing to? I mean, it's a long-term organizational problem. It's a dilemma. You want to keep winning games. You're in the race to get a first-round bye, and you're only getting it by the skin of your teeth because there's a bunch of 7-2, 6-3 teams in the NFC. What do you think about in terms of that long-term playoff push?
Man, that's so hard, and that's one of those decisions where you got to have the right coaching staff, right? So I hope for your guys' sake that you do. Because, you're talking about the entire viability of your season and your franchise. One thing that might help is when you guys get to the end of the season, if you guys can stack up some wins where you've got a nice buffer, maybe that's the time where you can spend some of those games seeing if he comes out and he is rusty and you've already locked up a spot, that maybe you can give him some quote-unquote garbage time to really see how he looks at full speed. Because until you guys get things locked up and until Case Keenum gives you a reason on the field to stop playing him, it's hard not to ride the hot hand, man. It's one of these things where, especially as a Rams fan, you got to remember, we haven't had a winning season since 2003. We've been so bad for so long. I don't think most NFL fans realize how I'm almost like a dad shaking my child. You don't understand how precious this time is, right? Like, postseason football is so good, and for a lot of franchises, it feels like, well, you don't have to worry about it. We'll be there next year, or it comes around every couple of years regardless. It really doesn't. There are some situations where if you screw it up, it might be a while before you taste this again. So, from my side, it's one of these things where I would probably stick with Case as long as he continues to give you the results that he has, and if that doesn't change, you can make these harder decisions in the offseason. But until then, the risk factor by rocking this boat is so high. And maybe that's just me. Maybe I'm too conservative of a guy in terms of football that I don't want to incur that kind of risk in the middle of a pretty successful season, right? Maybe that's what it comes down to. I'm just too scared.
He's got to grow a pair of bull balls.
I do. Yeah, I've got to grow a pair.
All right. Well, let's talk a little bit about that matchup then. So the Vikings have evidently an above-average offensive line. Praise be. They've got pretty good protection from. The feeling. They've got pretty good protection from like Mike Remmers and Riley Reif. And from what you've been saying, it sounds like they'll probably have a good game. Sounds like Pat Elflein, who has been kind of up and down, really good on the run, really highlight level plays for center. But really, some issues, making a bunch of mistakes. Sounds like he'll have a bad game. I kind of figure, I feel like there's not much ambiguity to how that offensive line, defensive line matchup looks, but I am a little bit more curious as to this receiver setup. There's a case to be made. Pro Football Focus made it. I think NFL Next Gen Stats or NFL.com has made it. ESPN, I think somebody on ESPN's made it. The Vikings have the top or a top 3 receiver duo in the NFL. They've also got a fairly competent tight end in Kyle Rudolph and a fairly decent receiving back in Jerick McKinnon. We talked a lot about, that secondary. We talked a little bit about, that linebacker group. Of that group of pass catchers, what do you think is going to happen just in general? Like, do you see Thielen going off? Do you see all of them being restricted? Do you see sort of the second or third sort of receiving option, doing a good job? And who scares you the most?
The interesting thing is this comes down to the first half. I wouldn't be surprised if whatever unit, whether it's your pass catchers or our secondary, wins that half, just dominates the game, because I think it's going to be one of these processes. And like we were talking about, the idea of the adjustments, I don't know that there's any way to adjust around this battle. I just think this is one because it's not necessarily a talent function. It's just a performance function. Adam Thielen's not an all-world athlete. There's a reason why it took him so many years. How many years did y'all have him before he broke out? 2 or 3, right? Where he had to learn some nuances. Yeah, it took him a while to learn some nuances of the technique of his job. That's where he excels, right? That's where Kayvon Webster has made his career. That's why Kayvon Webster wasn't a starter in Denver. He's not an overwhelming athlete, but the technique side is where he's been able to be competent enough with the Rams. So it's going to be that maybe more so than anything in terms of the defense versus offense is where the first half might tell the tale of the entire game. If there's a guy that I'm worried about, it might be Rudolph, because we haven't really faced many good tight ends The only one that really threatened anything prior to the game was Evan Ingram, and he had a great game. He was the only guy that had a great game for the Giants. And so Rudolph might scare me a little bit pregame. But overall, I mean, you mentioned his number one DVOA, that this is one of those challenges that I want to see the defense take on. If there was one person that I was going to be, now I feel like a jerk for bringing this up, but it would have been Dalvin Cook, right? Dalvin Cook, this would have been a perfect game for him to be the major threat for y'all's offense. And now I feel bad. I'm sorry.
Don't worry about it. Vikings fans are very used to their star players getting injured. I mean, Sam Bradford technically, right?
Now I feel even worse.
But yeah, like I think sort of one of the things when it comes down to, hey, you've got a pretty good offense against a pretty good defense on both sides of the ball. One of the things that this usually, people will kind of rely on as a crutch is, oh, well, then special teams will decide it. And that's not always the case. But the Rams have a fairly incredible group of special teamers. Greg Zuerlein and Pharaoh Cooper got my votes in the Pro Bowl as the kicker and return specialist. Johnny Hecker, great punter, just missed out. Sorry, I had to vote for Marquette King. What do you think is sort of behind the special teams unit? It's been good, even going back to Dear Leader. And do you think that they'll be enough to swing the game? I mean, the Vikings have pretty good kickoff and punt coverage, but they don't have a very good, or I should say very reliable kicker or a very good punting game.
Yeah, the special teams units are incredible, and it's one of those things where you get the confluence of talent and coaching. John Fossil's a phenomenal special teams coach. That's why he was the interim head coach when Dear Leader left. And he's got plenty of experience. He's one of those rare guys that you hear talked about as a head coaching candidate coming off of special teams. And there's a reason.
That's him and Dave too. But
the ear of the room. Yep. And it's one of those things where when you've got the talent that Greg Zuerlein does, Zuerlein's always had a leg. He's always had a ridiculous leg. And I remember I told Danny Kelly when he was running field goals a couple of years ago that my bold prediction was that at some point Greg Zuerlein would kick a 70-yard field goal. He hasn't had the opportunity yet, but he's been pretty close. And he's nailed a couple long 60-yarders. And I remember when Blair Walsh was a rookie, it was that Blair Walsh, Greg Zuerlein competition that, I don't know that there's still that competition anymore. But what's going to be interesting is where Greg Zuerlein has really struggled has been, especially a couple of years ago, in the big kicks. It's not that, it has nothing to do with like 40 yards, turf versus grass, indoor versus outdoor. He's been incredibly consistent with that. It's been fourth quarter kicks where he's really needed, and he hasn't had a ton of those this game. He's got a boot. He had the 7 field goal game against Dallas. He's only missed 1 field goal all year. And because the Rams just haven't been in any pressure situations, it's been one of those things where I'm not really sure if that's still going to be something he struggles with. But to this point, yeah, there's no way to really complain about anything from special teams. It's been a phenomenal set of units, both punt coverage, the rare punts downfield, and then obviously kick coverage on kickoffs, as well as Greg Zuerlein in the field goal unit. It's really, really, really strong.
Tell me a little bit about Pharaoh Cooper, because, I mean, I think the Rams are top 3 in field position after kickoffs, and I think he's been taking kickoffs, and he's also the punt return specialist. He's been doing a pretty decent job there. I think, does he have 2 punt return touchdowns? 1? Yeah. Anyway,
and he took over from Savon. Oh,
yeah. Sorry, keep going.
Yeah, he's got. No, it's all good. He's got those 2 touchdowns. But what's really interesting on the kickoffs is Benny Cunningham was the league leader in average return when he was back there. I think there's a case to be made that it's just a well-coached unit that blocks really, really, really well, and really smart in when they take kickoff returns out. But in terms of the punt returns, it was Tavon Austin to start the year, and he fumbled, I think, 4. It was either 4 or 5. It was just one of those things where once he had, it was crazy. It was one of those things where and even then he had 2 where he like bobbled them. It doesn't even count as a fumble, where he just kind of caught it against his chest and it bounced up, and he had to capture it back before he fumbled. He just got inside his own head, and it was one of those things where the change had to be made. And the Rams did a good job of keeping it professional. They didn't really throw him under the bus. And it's one of those things where Tavon has done the right things, said the right things, and they moved on, and there's no reason to look back because it's been as successful as the numbers indicate.
Awesome. Well, that's mostly it that I have for direct questions. We have a couple of Twitter questions. One of them I found kind of interesting. How many pressures would Everson Griffin have to have for it to be considered a successful day against Andrew Whitworth? And how many sacks do you think it is? I mean, because Griffin probably could have a successful day with no sacks, especially given who Andrew Whitworth is. But how many pressures do you think that would be for you to say, yeah, Griffin won that matchup?
2.
Yeah.
Where good, man. Where was it good? And it's not just the 2 pressures. It's also that Goff's done a really, really good job of managing situations, whether it's throwing the ball away, moving out of the pocket. His pocket presence is much better this year. Just, the legal kind of grounding where you're just throwing it at guys' feet to kill off a play. He's been much, much better with his decision making this year. So getting pressures in a conventional sense where you've really got a chance to get at the quarterback is rare, just because A, the blocking has been so good, but B, Goff's a much headier guy, even though he's as young as he is, and he's only started 16 games.
All right, Dusty, do we have any mailbag questions that are particular? I mean, you mentioned that there were a couple that were well suited to Joe here.
Well, they all are, although something bad happened to Google Docs. I went to open the tab and the document disappeared.
Oh, no.
Happening. It's finally I've got this theory, guys. I'll throw this out there for you. Sure. I've got this theory that Google has this long game, right? They're going to, and I know I'm not a big fan of conspiracy theories, but this one makes too much sense. Everything is going to move to Google. It's going to be Google Docs, Google credit cards, Google cars, Google water. Google's going to own everything, right? It'll be the Google NFL. Somewhere I tweeted the other day that in 25 years, the Los Angeles Rams will be playing in a brand new Hub Arena. What was the company? Sponsored by Integral, the combination of Google and Coca-Cola, right? So at some point here, I wake up and sweat sometimes with this. To wake up and realize all your Google Docs have begun, and you're just going to have a message from Google with a price. It's going to be a price tag to get everything back. And so when you tell me the docs are gone, I get very worried that this is the beginning of the great Google blackmail. Tell me you found them.
Well, so this was like...
I copied and pasted them into Word, so I have them. But
hooray, it finally opened. Okay. So John Belk writes in, does Keenum and possibly Bradford getting trucks of money this offseason put the Vikings in a spot to do well with compensatory picks for once?
Yeah, actually. Yeah, that's surprising. Yeah, that's a good point. And I don't think either of them are going to sign with the Vikings. So there you go. There's going to be like $12 million for one, 20 for the other.
What do the contract situations look like in terms of when they expire for your 3 guys?
This year, all 3 of them.
All 3. That's
yeah.
Perfect.
Well, Kyle Sluter, they've got him locked down for a couple of years, but otherwise, the 3 quarterbacks, Bradford, Bridgewater, and Keenum, they expire. It's gonna be fun. It's gonna be great.
Exactly. As soon as we get done with the who gets to start foolish argument that goes on and on for weeks with endless trolling, we can immediately pivot to who gets a contract. Like within minutes.
It's great.
Kyle Slaby writes in, will LaMarcus Joyner accidentally over-pursue a run to the sidelines and take out Teddy?
Took out Teddy once.
See, and I mentioned LaMarcus, and this is funny since I just mentioned he took out Will Fuller last game. I think it's one of those things where LaMarcus is a really physical player, and it's one of those things where when Jeff Fisher is your head coach and Greg Williams is your defensive coordinator, that's one of those L's you just got to earn. You just got to take it. You just have to take whether it's the dirty label or whatever labels I'm sure we're getting thrown in the comments at Daily Norseman after that game. That's just an L that the Rams got to earn. That's one of those things you bring on when you hire that guy.
God, I hate him.
Kyle also writes, what's your favorite way to cook lamb?
I'll let you take that.
Oh, man. This is the hardest question you guys have asked me all day. I would say it depends on what cut, right? You got roasted leg is perfect. You got braised lamb. You got barbacoa. Have you guys ever had like traditional old school barbacoa where you put a head in the ground?
I haven't had it with lamb. I have had old school barbacoa with a pig.
Yeah. What's
delicious.
The best way to cook a lamb? I'll go with a roasted leg, only because it's so classic and it's easy to do at home and it makes for a great presentation. That I don't know that there's a bad way. The only bad way I might know is like haggis. Have you guys ever had haggis? Have you ever done that?
I got real close to getting some when I was in London, but avoided it.
Yeah, I'm aware of it. I would eat it on a dare.
It's one of those things. No, go ahead. Let's hear the haggis story.
No, there is no story. I would eat it on a dare. That's about it.
Yeah, I mean, I ate it on a self-dare because I'm one of those idiots. But it's one of those things where I feel like you should do it if you can, just to do it. But that might be the answer, is anything but haggis. That's the best way to prepare it.
All right. Yeah, Dusty, what are the questions we got?
We already addressed this one. Already addressed this one. Yeah, you guys were too comprehensive in your interview. Either that or the questions we get are pedestrian. Emil Ramsvik writes in, what is the thinnest position group on the Vikings right now?
Thinnest? I mean, the offensive line's performing well, but I would argue that they're pretty thin. The receivers, obviously, the top two receivers, there's a big drop off from there, but I wouldn't argue that they're as thin as the offensive line. One more injury to the offensive line, and I'm really worried. I know Rashad Hill did pretty well, but I'm not going to trust that over the course of a full season. Cornerbacks, I mean, you've got Terrence Newman to step in. Safeties, Anthony Harris has played really well. Linebackers, that's a problem because I don't really trust Emmanuel Lemur to step in if one of the two go down. But yeah, actually, I'm gonna switch to linebackers. It has to be linebackers because quarterbacks, I mean, we got 4.
All right. Matt in Wisconsin writes in, does a fair assessment of Case Keenum compare his performance against a replacement-level backup quarterback or replacement-level starting quarterback?
I mean, Keenum is clearly better than a replacement-level backup quarterback. I would argue that the way that we should evaluate Keenum, because the way it informs the way that we talk about him, is against starters, especially because that's the kind of contract he'll be getting. That's the kind of debate we're having with regards to Teddy Bridgewater. And it's what's going to determine how well the Vikings do, is how he performs relative to other starters in the NFL. So, yeah, he's outperforming the role the Vikings signed him for, which is backup, by a huge, significant margin. But just generally, you evaluate him at this moment, given what his role is kind of morphed into, as a starting level quarterback. And he's all right.
Alan Toth writes in, how does Rhett Ellison's dad feel about the Giants locker room under Ben McAdoo?
Joe, if you don't know about this, Ricky Ellison, who actually works at a nuclear policy think tank, posted, I think, on Facebook that he was glad Rhett Ellison got away from the Vikings locker room, signed with the Giants, because of the toxic locker room situation. And I feel like maybe the Giants are not an upgrade. They're not an upgrade. There's a witch hunt right now to root out the rats that have said that Ben McAdoo has lost the locker room. In the meantime, Ben McAdoo has lost the locker room. It's great.
Well, we're talking toxic like emotions wise, not like Tampa Bay, like actually toxic.
As far as we know.
As far as we know. And Tommy Gunn writes in, top underrated leftover Halloween candy. Isn't that like a ATM machine? Aren't they? If they're leftover, aren't they? Well, whatever. What is the top underrated leftover Halloween candy? What's the best of the rest?
Yeah, I don't know. See, because even the Mr. Good bars go pretty quickly, don't they? So I can't even use those. Yeah, I don't have an answer here. Probably the Smart Tarts.
Gosh, I would say anything left over.
Anything but haggis.
If there's haggis in your Halloween basket, you are doing it wrong. Demand not haggis. Demand Norse code. Don from Ohio writes in, what is the best candy to help give you an energy boost for long shifts at work?
So I found a chocolate bar that has caffeine in it. So that's my answer. I'm gonna really quickly Google, what that is, because I've been eating that. I think they're just called Awake bars, and they've got a little owl on them. They've got a surprising amount of caffeine. I mean, chocolate naturally has caffeine, but not enough that you list it on the thing. This has got caffeine added. Yeah, Awake bars. I've used them a lot, and they do keep me awake and alert and productive.
They taste good? They don't taste weird?
No, I mean, they not super weird. Like, you know how like chocolate flavored like health food doesn't taste anything like chocolate? It's not like that.
Okay.
They taste slightly different. They mostly taste like milk chocolate. You can kind of tell the difference. It's not a huge difference.
And Arif, is this just meth? Is this a meth bar? What in the world are you describing, man?
I mean, yeah, but it's legal and it won't rot your teeth, probably.
How many can you purchase at a grocery store without ID? If the answer is one or less, you can't take me.
It's good. It's fine. It's fine. I'm fine.
You sound fine. Okay. Last question, and then we'll be out. Would you make or eat a spaghetti burrito?
Why? I mean, like on a dare, I would certainly eat one, but it just feels like a poor combination of forms. I feel like you get more out of spaghetti outside of the burrito. You can get more out of a burrito than putting spaghetti in it. It's minimizing. But yeah, I would eat one. It probably wouldn't be bad.
See, my concern is that... Go ahead.
I want to eat at that restaurant. I don't know what weird concoctions this new chef has that he's capable of, but I like where he's going.
Now, see, I disagree. I think this guy is doing the Hollywood thing. Like, there's no interesting food left to make. So now it's just reboots and mashups and sequels that no one asked for. And no, I would neither make nor eat a spaghetti burrito.
I think that's in the new Avengers. The Avengers, the Infinity Spaghetti Burrito.
That's actually where the last Infinity Gem is. It's inside a spaghetti burrito.
The spaghetti burrito.
We'll never find it.
I would never find it. But, I just saw Thor Ragnarok last night. And let me tell you, Jeff Goldblum steals that movie. He is incredible.
Yeah, I mean, he's an incredible actor. I mean, he's one of the greatest actors of our generation. I'm not even joking. He's awesome.
He was just perfect in his role. He'd shoot up the scenery in every scene he was in. And if you stick around till the very end credits, he is in the second stinger. So if you haven't seen it yet, make sure you don't leave before the final credit rolls. If you appreciate the fine work of American treasure Jeff Goldblum.
All right. So that's the show, right?
Yeah, that's going to do it for episode number 209, approximately, of Norse Code. Shoot us an email, norsecodepodcast@gmail.com, with beer name suggestions or mailbag questions or, whatever else you got. And, of course, the outro has all of our other details in it. Thank you to Head Boy Joe McAtee for joining us this afternoon. His Twitter handle is at 3K_. So give him a follow. He's not a frequent tweeter, but a very high quality tweeter. And of course, you know where to find the rest of us. Thanks to Useful Human Arif Hassan and to long-suffering host Dusty O'Connell, which is me. We'll be back early next week with a recap of what is hopefully a win over the Rams. But until then, demand excellence. Demand Norse Code. Norse Code is the largest and only division of Norse Code LLC. You can find Norse Code on the Daily Norseman, SB Nation's Vikings blog at dailynorseman.com. You can also find it on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music Podcasts, or wherever else fine podcasts are aggregated. Our Vikings blogger extraordinaire and generally useful human is Arif Hassan, who can be found on Twitter at Arif Hassan NFL. Our intrepid producer and occasional co-host James Pogachnik can be found on Twitter at Big Mono or curating the official Norse Code Twitter feed at NorseCodeDN. I'm your host with a firm grasp of the obvious, Dusty O'Connell, and my name is my handle on Twitter. If you'd like to donate a few bucks to the show, your one-time donation can be made at paypal.me/NorseCode, or a recurring monthly contribution can be made by visiting patreon.com/NorseCode. Please visit our website, norsecodepodcast.com, where you'll find links to our Facebook and YouTube pages, along with the episode archive and some other good stuff. And any questions or comments that won't fit in a tweet can be emailed to norsecodepodcast@gmail.com. And on behalf of the entire Norse Code staff, thank you so much for listening.
Our formula is this. We go out, we hit people in the mouth.